You're listening to the Book Talk Today podcast, a podcast that inspires readers to obtain valuable insights to inform, educate, and improve lives. My name is Abdi. I'm an avid reader, best known for the creation of the 1 Minute Book Review community, and I'm sitting down with authors to delve deeper into the books they have written to uncover the story behind the story. Hello Book Talk Today family, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Talk Today podcast. My name is Orn, I am your host, and in today's podcast we are joined again by Ben Aldridge. Ben came on the podcast for episode 4 nearly 2 years ago, and it's great to have him back on the podcast to discuss his new book, How to Control The Uncontrollable, 10 game-changing ideas to help you think like a Stoic and build a resilient life. Ben's first book was more around his experience battling his own mental health issues and how some of the tactics that he used to do that. And he mentioned Stoicism briefly in that first book, but this book definitely is more of an exploration into his pursuit and learning of Stoicism and how it's helped him in many different ways throughout his own life. I've read quite extensively on Stoicism, not only through, Ryan Holiday's commentaries, The Obstacle is the Way, Ego is the Enemy, The Daily Stoic. He's written many fabulous books on Stoicism, but that then made me go and read other books, original texts like Letters from a Stoic by Seneca, or the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So Stoicism is definitely something that has come in more prominence over the last 5 to 10 years, and there's been many reasons for that. And in Ben's book and in our conversation, we talk about some of the misconceptions around Stoicism and actually how it can help you live a better life, because ultimately that is what philosophy is about. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the podcast. Every week we release a podcast with an author, discuss their book and the ideas and principles inside of it. We have some really amazing authors lined up in the next coming months, so definitely subscribe whether you're listening to this on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. Definitely hit that subscribe button to stay in touch and tuned for upcoming episodes. I really hope that you enjoy this episode with Ben. Here it is now. Ben, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast.
No, it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having me on.
It's great to have you back. I think I recall I was having a look through the previous episode. It was during lockdown and it was our 4th episode, which is crazy to think now. This will be probably episode 70. So it's amazing to think how far we've both come, from your first book to now your second book and this podcast as well. So it's great to have you back on. So what have you been up to? What's changed in that period of time?
So I've been pretty busy since we last spoke. I've written another book. I've created a deck of challenge cards, and I've had a little boy as well. So life is insanely busy, but it's been amazing. A couple of years. That's
really good. How's the little boy, and how has that changed perhaps your perspective on life in general?
Also, I love being a father. I feel very lucky that I get to experience this. It's a really nice, game-changing kind of experience. So this is it. There's a lot of meaning to it, and I guess you always think it's going to be a huge deal, but then when it actually happens, it's incredible. So it's been really nice, and I'm enjoying just trying to savor it because it goes so quickly. He's 9 months already, and I can't believe it's gone like that, finger snap, and it's insane. And I think it just highlights how quickly life can fly by. And he's so present. He's so like everything is just like he's just exploring, and he's so curious. And I think there's a lot of lessons we can learn from that. I think being present is something that's so important, and I love sort of observing that in him.
Yeah, I've seen that in my 2 nieces as well. So, my brother in the last couple of years has had 2 daughters, and one's just about to turn 2, and the other one's like maybe 4 or 5 months old. And the one who's just about to turn 2, you're right. She's so present. She just enjoys everything that's around her. She doesn't think about anything else. It's either it's funny enough. She goes from one person in the household to another to watch a different cartoon. It's hilarious.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's nice. Yeah, it's great.
So how's the new book come along? And I know it sticks on the same subject of Stoicism, and I think your first book was very much about this idea of challenges and challenging yourself. And the deck of cards that you sent to me as well is that idea of challenging yourself. So what was the new approach with this book, and what different direction did you take it in?
So yeah, this is really an exploration of Stoicism, the kind of all of Stoicism. So it's been really nice for me to kind of dig into this subject in more detail, and I've learned so much in the process. I've loved writing it. It's been really, really fun, and I guess really the key theme really in my writing and my ideas is the practical side of it. So my first book is packed with challenges, deck of cards, just challenges. So with this book that's mainly on Stoicism, there are challenges, but they're more philosophical. They're more about how how you work in your head. So it's very different. But it's just been great to sort of dive into one subject and be very detailed with that.
Mm.
So I've loved that. It's been really interesting. It's been a great process.
And for anyone who's listening that perhaps doesn't know Stoicism, that would surprise me, but I'm sure there's still some people out there that are listening to this that don't know what Stoicism is or understand maybe a brief history. Do you want to just give them a brief? I know it's very difficult to do that, but like a brief, maybe a couple of sentences about what the core tenets of Stoicism is.
Yeah, so Stoicism, the purpose of it is to help us live better lives. So it's a philosophy, not a religion. So it's a set of ideas that we can play around with that can help us ultimately to flourish. The Stoics sort of accept that life can be pretty chaotic and throws curveballs at us all the time, but we can manage that and we can flourish and we can learn to thrive irrespective of what happens to us. And that's really the purpose of getting into this in the first place. So it's incredibly practical.
I think what a lot of people have is they have this misunderstanding about what Stoicism is. People like to think when they describe a person, they describe them as they're very stoic, they're very unemotional, they're very aloof, maybe to a degree, but that's probably not the
Mhm.
right word. But they're not very present. But I actually think the more you study Stoicism, the more you actually realize it's actually the opposite.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's like the common misconception of the philosophy because you've got Stoic with a lowercase s, which is exactly what you just said, and I think a lot of people confuse that with the uppercase S, Stoicism. The actual nuanced philosophy that's very rich, and it's not about repressing feelings and being cold and an emotionless robot. I think that's probably the main thing that people just assume that if you're into this, that's it. You're Terminator, but actually, it's not that at all. It's just learning how. One of the things is learning how to manage your emotions and how to control them, or at least attempt to. It's not easy to do this,
Yeah.
but I think having some kind of system in place and something that you can use when you're dealing with powerful emotions is very handy, and that's why I think
Mm.
it's great for so many people.
How had your relationship with Stoicism changed then? Maybe, when you had written the first book, and I know in the first book you talk a lot about your journey and your mental health and how Stoicism helped you in that way. But how, when exploring Stoicism to perhaps more depth, like you've done in this book, how has that changed your relationship with Stoicism, or how is it perhaps not changed but adapted?
Well, I think it's initially, yeah, as you said, it helped me with my anxiety. I credit it as being the thing that really lifted me out of that particularly dark place. But then I found that it trickled into other areas of my life. So it's something that I now use every single day. And I like the example of an operating system. The way that we look at the world is kind of
Mm.
like an operating system. So, Stoicism is like a frame or like a lens through which I frame the world. Not all the time. I try and bring it in, and sometimes it's difficult to apply all of these theoretical things to life, but it does make a difference if you can make it work and you can test it out. So I feel that it's just kind of everywhere now. Whatever I face, I try and think about, okay, what would the Stoics do? How would they handle this? Especially if I'm making a meal of it and just really struggling. So I think it's good to think about it like that.
Yeah, I'm sure with your approach to fatherhood and being a parent, it must be a great frame in which to do that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, I think it's nice because there's a huge emphasis on character and virtue. So I think that's something that's just kind of reeling it back and looking at the fundamentals of what makes a decent human being. What's an important thing for us to think about when we're bringing up children. So I feel that this is, like one of the core pillars to Stoicism is that sense of virtue. So I think that that's something that I want to be able to help my son understand as well. Just, getting those morals and getting that ethic, kind of strong ethical framework in place. I mean, he's not one yet, so it's hard to kind of put all of that into play. But you know what I mean? It's just this
Are
kind
you
of.
not reading him Epictetus and Cicero and Marcus Aurelius's diaries yet?
Well, actually, I have read him some of Meditations by
Have you?
Marcus Aurelius, but you know what I
It
mean. He's
doesn't
not up
surprise
to
me.
his, yeah. But I think it's good because it helps you to really focus on what does it mean to be a good human being, and these things are important to think about.
Actually, I don't think I asked you this question when we first spoke, but were you religious at all growing up, or did you follow a certain faith, or did you find that that didn't give you the perhaps moral and ethical background that you were looking for, and you saw Stoicism as being that?
Do you know what? I didn't grow up religious. I think I had an interest in Buddhism and Eastern philosophy because my mum was into it. My mum used to be a Buddhist for a very brief period of time, so she was interested in that. So I think I inherited a curiosity for lots of different ideas, and then I guess I read a lot, got into read a lot of new atheist books, and kind of explored that, but then sort of came back to more sort of middle ground. I guess sort of if we're talking what I think, I'm more agnostic, sort of open to the
Mm.
possibilities, and I think it's quite hard to be. I don't know. I like that openness. I think there's so much that we don't know. So I think borrowing and using ideas from different places to me makes sense anyway. I like that I can connect deeply to the Stoics and that moral framework, but also that I can borrow from Zen Buddhism and different ideas and, like modern therapies and science and, all these different places. So I think it's important for me anyway to just cherry pick from all over the place.
Yeah, I love that idea as well. As someone who is religious, I feel like sometimes people put themselves into a corner and they don't explore and they read other places. But I think, I've had people who are Muslim and say to me, like, why are you reading Stoicism type of thing? And I kind of think to myself, there's so many similarities, across the board. I think a lot of people like to see the differences between different places. But I think
Mm.
the more that you read and the more that you educate yourself, you realize there's more similarities than differences across the board.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it can complement, I think in Stoicism in particular, can complement a faith incredibly well because I think it's based on principles and ideas. It's not asking you to abandon your faith in a way. I think it's helping you to think about things from a philosophical point of view, which I think definitely can complement a religious mindset and a religious sort of
Mm.
perspective. So yeah, it's kind of it's good for everyone.
Yeah, it was interesting because in the book you talked about, I think in the beginning of the book you talked about this concept of indifference to things,
Mm,
and in Arabic, in Islamic theology, there's this word called zuhud, which is basically like having. There's no like direct correlation to the English language for a specific word, but it's basically like indifference to all things that is happening to you, in that respect. And when I was reading that bit, it kind of got me back to that piece of philosophy, which is like not to have attachment to these things, whether it be material
mm.
things, whether it be to events that are happening, whatever it might be. And that level of indifference really is a weight off your shoulder.
Yeah, that's really nice to see that parallel. I think it's interesting. You see these themes across different ideas. People come at things from different angles. The indifference, the concept of indifference, that things aren't intrinsically good or bad, and that it's how you label it, and that sense of non-attachment. There's also parallels in Buddhism, so it's amazing to see all of these connections and how there's this. I guess it's like a universal truth, this kind of thing that people are
Mm.
still they're trying to figure out what's going on in the world and trying to make sense of it. And I guess there's certain principles and ideas that it is really interesting to see how they've been discovered from all over the place and they come to very similar conclusions. So I think that there's a lot to be said for that.
Where do you think that comes from? I know this is a very rhetorical question, but it's one I think about a lot, and I do a lot of writing about it for myself. Is like, where do those universal values come from? Because I think in the West, people think those universal values come from like the Bible, but in Eastern philosophy, it seems to be a little more fluid. And I know there's a lot of individuals, and perhaps there's this truth that a lot of Western thinking is based on Eastern philosophy as well. So, do you do much thinking about that, and perhaps where those universal values come from?
The source of those universal values is a very
Yeah, like
tricky
yeah, that
question, I
source of
think.
it.
I think there's probably something within all of us that there's, like I said with my little boy, there's a curiosity. So I think there's this understanding that people want to have. They want to try and figure out what's going on. It's a basic human desire, is to try and understand the environment and try and understand themselves. So I guess it's there's something there that when you start searching, people come up with answers if they sit and they listen and they pay attention to their mind, or if they, if they get into philosophy, or if they deep thinking. I think it's interesting that there's these conclusions that they come to that are the same. And I guess maybe there's just something within humanity at large. There's something, this kind of, I don't know, this universal truth that people can tap into or understand by through
Mm.
contemplation. And there might be sort of tweaks and different angles that people have from different geographical regions of the planet. But I think, yeah, it's an interesting concept to think about. And actually, it's quite, it's a tricky thing to have like a clear, concrete answer to it. So
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry if
it
that's a bit
is.
of a
No,
funny answer, but
I did premise it by saying it's a rhetorical question. It was
yeah.
more this idea that, like, for me, when I think about it, similar to you, is like each one of us has this curiosity. They have this internal question about, what is our purpose, what are we doing, what is our place in this world and in our universe. And I think from there stems all these other questions, all these other philosophies, all these other, religions about, our place. I think it derives from questioning everything that is around us, and that's why I think it's so important.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I think that's it. Questions are the key, really. Just being able to question things and keep asking, and it will take you to some interesting places.
And that's why you see in history, those oppressive regimes that don't allow people to question and ask questions, and are usually the ones that are usually the most toxic. Because I think that, if you read history, you realize that at periods of growth and at periods of where people are making the most progress is when people were able to ask those open questions and not fear that they're going to get their head chopped off.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think if you can't ask questions, then there's something is seriously wrong. There's a red flag there, because that's how, I guess in an ideal world, how you would progress as a society and a civilization is to
Yeah.
ask questions. And that this is the sort of foundation of science, really, isn't it? It's just debate and being able to have a civilized conversation with other people. So I think, yeah, that's something that it's interesting in Stoicism. The foundation of everything really is based on logic and reasoning, and this sort of scientific inquiry, being able to ask questions and using logic and being able to debate something is kind of a fundamental part of the philosophy. So I think it's
Mm.
it's interesting. The Stoics, they would clash with a lot of tyrants, and there's a lot of interesting things that happened in history with them and pushing up against repression of speech and things. So I think it's
Mm.
there's this sort of theme, isn't it, of being able to
Yeah.
question stuff.
Yeah, definitely. What's your approach to research and questioning things? Because I love to hear from people who have done a lot of reflection. Because I think, anytime you do any type of writing, whether it be a book or, you're going down this road, you've obviously asked a lot of questions of yourself before you even go down and write it for someone else. So what's your approach to like research and questioning and actually collating this information?
So it normally starts with excessive reading and just getting into as many different books as possible. I try and, like, for instance, with this subject, Stoicism is something I've been reading about for a very long time. But I think when I was doing this book, it was really just filling in the gaps and sort of expanding as well, trying to get more of a broader context. And then I make loads of notes, and then I think there's a lot of time when you're creating a book that you can reflect as well. You have to think about how it all ties together. And actually, this is for me one of the greatest things about writing, is that it helps me to understand everything better, because I'm having to sort of synthesize all of this information and make it accessible, and through my how I would sort of describe things, so through my personality. And I try, and very much this book is quite, if you know, my writing style is quite casual, and I like to take big concepts and just try and sort of make them super accessible. So I think for me, the actual writing process is something that it really helps with all of that. So that's why I really enjoy working on a book like this, where I really get to dive in deep into this subject. But it's that process. Also, going and talking. My wife has to hear me talk about this stuff all the time, and she's brilliant, because she's someone who, she's got an amazing mind, the way she thinks as well. She's very logical. Um, Her dad was a detective, and I think that she's kind of inherited this mind that's very, like, she's great at piecing stuff together. So whenever we have conversations,
Yeah.
it's great. And I think that whenever I read a book, I always take loads of notes, and then I always try and have conversations about it, because I think that's interesting, because it's not just a monologue that way. You're getting some feedback, you're having this interaction with someone else, and they will, bring questions to the table that you hadn't even thought about. So I think that's probably how I try and think about new ideas, and how I process it.
Yeah, I think this goes back to this concept that I talk about a lot, which is like when you write or when you speak about something, it's actually your process of learning it. Like when you
Mm.
read a book, that isn't learning. Like you're just taking in information. It's like you're just taking in data. But like you said, that process of synthesizing that material, putting it into your own words, having conversations, that's the actual learning process, which I think a lot of people, when they read books, is a very passive way of learning. They just
Mm.
read the book and they expect to retain it. But you need to have conversations. You need to write about it. You need to reflect on it in order to actually start that because that's the start of the learning journey. And then as time goes on, you sort of repeat that process, and it gets ingrained.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. That's it. And what's scary is how quickly you can forget stuff as well if you're not keeping on top of it.
Yeah.
So I think if you're
Yeah.
interested in a specific topic, I tend to find that I just sort of try and top my knowledge up. So I'll read every couple of months. If there's a theme, there's lots of themes that I read around. So I'm interested in things, obviously, like philosophy, but nature. And so I try and visit, every like fifth or sixth book, I'll make sure that it's like a nature book or something like that. So it's just trying to, top up that knowledge, and it's so easy to forget. And unless you're using it all the time, unless you're actually practically using a lot of these ideas, unfortunately, they just kind of disappear, don't they?
They do. They disappear somewhere, and then you read about it again, and then it just like a flash of light goes
Mm.
off in your brain, and you're like, ah, that was it. And it goes back to this thing that I talk about a lot, which is like, I liken reading to building a wall of knowledge, and like each brick in that wall is like a book. So
Mm.
it's not necessarily like the most impactful books that you've ever read. It's like every single book you read forms this wall, and it sort of sees patterns. And the more books you read, that stronger the wall is, because you see like patterns between different books. That's the way I like to describe it. Because a lot of people say to me, they're like, "What is the 5 best books you've ever read?" And I'm like, well, kind of every book that I've read has helped me to a degree,
Mm.
whether they be books that I've really disliked or books that I, really enjoy.
Yeah, I love that example. That's a really great, very wise way of thinking of it, because you're so right. It just has this impact. There's this, yeah. It's hard to sort of pin down which book is the best book, but because you're right, they all support each other, and you can make these links that you wouldn't necessarily have made in the past, and you can start to see bigger themes, bigger picture, and you start to look at human history in a slightly different way when you're like kind of stepping back, and you've got all of these different little bricks. Yeah, I love that example. It's very good, really good.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to take a bit of a U-turn here, and we're
Okay,
gonna.
let's do
I
it.
was having a look through Instagram, a couple of a couple of weeks ago, and I saw you walking through a tube station with a banana. And I'm like, Ben, what are you doing? What are you doing here? I think Ben's gone crazy. And then I read the book, and then you were talking about this idea of, voluntary like discomfort and that type of stuff. So can you just talk about why you were walking through a tube station with a banana as a pet?
So this is a great exercise. This is like philosophy in action, and I would encourage everyone to actually try this out because it's actually pretty hard mentally. So the idea comes from, this specific exercise is used in modern therapy, and it's part of rational emotive behavioral therapy, which was created by a man called Albert Ellis, and he had a great sense of humor. And he would encourage his clients to go and do things to deliberately embarrass themselves so that they could overcome their internal dialogue that's telling them that they're stupid, or they've got this negative internal dialogue and they're so worried about how people judge them. And this was used very successfully to help people with social anxiety. So he would get them to do these bizarre things. And he was inspired by the Stoics. And that's where all of this has come from, really. We know that the Roman Stoic Cato would deliberately wear something stupid so that he could feel embarrassed, he could feel shame, and then he could overcome that shame in his head. So this exercise really cuts through all of that. It's such a stupid exercise, and that's, I guess, why I like it so much. You simply get a banana, tie some string to it, and then you just go for a walk, and people will point at you, they'll laugh at you, and in your head you're going to be going, okay, what am I doing? What am I doing? And that is the whole point. You challenge that internal dialogue, and the more you do it, the easier it becomes.
How many people actually did stare and point though? Because I can imagine most people just went, "Oh, what the hell?" It's just a normal day in London, isn't it? Some dude walking around with a banana.
Yeah, less people than you. Yeah, it's not. Because initially when you're doing this, you think like, "Oh my god, everyone's going to look," but actually, it really isn't that bad. There's not that many people, but it's what's going on in here, what's going on in your mind that's the problem. I'll tell you the most embarrassing thing that I did, which doesn't even sound that embarrassing. It's was to walk backwards through Hyde Park, through the whole of Hyde Park. And the cynics who inspired the Stoics used to do this. They used to walk backwards to challenge the status quo, to look at the way that their minds work when they're feeling embarrassed. But this exercise is incredibly embarrassing because when you're walking backwards, people are walking a lot faster than you. It's hard to walk fast backwards. So they're coming at you and you can see them looking at you. And it's just, I don't know, I find that whole thing is really difficult in the head. And it's just me. It's all me. Like, no one cares. No one's like, literally no one said anything. People were just like, oh yeah, there's just some guy walking backwards through the park. Why is he doing that? But yeah, it's all what's going on in my mind. And that's why I think it's such a brilliant exercise, because it is all about looking at your mind, looking at your internal dialogue, your perception, all of this. And it's very practical, it's testing it out in the real world. So those are the two things that I think people should definitely try: walking backwards in public and taking a banana for a walk.
So I remember reading, I think a book on Stoicism. I can't remember if it was Tim Ferriss said it or Ryan Holiday, one of them. And they said that, and you mentioned it in your book as well, this idea that you go to a place that they don't really, accept discounts. And I went to Starbucks and I just asked for like a 30% discount. Because I read that and I thought, I'm going to try that because it's going to be really awkward. And I love awkward sort of interactions with people. Like I love that. Do you know that when you tell like a joke or a story and there's like an awkward silence? Like I live for that. I love it. And I went to the Starbucks and poor girl, she must have been like, 19 or 20. And this is like her first job. She's probably like, this is in the afternoon. So she's probably done a full day. And I go up to her and I'm like, yeah, can I have a latte? I think it was like a latte or something. She was like, yeah, sure. It's like £2.50. I was like, you wouldn't mind if I just, had a little 30% discount, just for today. She's like, uh, okay. And I'm like, okay, cool. That was fun.
You got the
it's because I think most people, they just, I got the discount because most people aren't expecting it. That's what, and it was in that moment that I realized, you have that concept and like, you don't ask, you don't get. Yeah. And I think, so much time we think of the worst outcome before we've even asked for it. If that makes sense. Like we were predicting someone's going to say no before we even ask. And I think that really taught me this idea that, you don't know until you go and do whatever you want to do. Like there's no point thinking of predicting about what may or may not happen.
Yeah. You're so right. You're so right. I think that's it. You got to try it, because you never know what's going to happen, and it's all to do with your perception. For instance, I sort of, to take a sort of slide away from that. A similar thing I think is, like, when I solved the Rubik's cube, I thought it was going to be really hard, like insanely difficult, and my perception was like, I'm never going to be able to do it. But actually trying it and realizing it's not that bad is a great example of, your mind is telling you something, but it's very different from the reality of it. So that's why I think it's important to have practicality in everything. And that's why I think, yeah, a lot of the ideas that I write about and talk about, I think I always want to try and tag them to something that people can go and do, so they can actually test out the idea in the real world.
Mm. That's why I think experience is so important. Like I have so many, a lot of my followers are like 18 to 34. That's like the main age bracket. I'm 29 now, so there's a lot of my followers that are younger than me. And they all say to me that like they read these books and they don't understand them. And I kind of say to myself, well, you kind of have to live a bit to understand them. Like you can't just read the book and sort of understand it. You need to experience life whilst reading the books, if that makes sense. And I think this is where, your concept of doing these challenges is really important, because if you don't understand that feeling, no book's going to tell you what that feeling is. You're going to have to experience that firsthand.
Yeah, of course, and that's it. You got to get out there. You got to feel it, because it doesn't make sense. The thing is, as well, different books will resonate with you at different points in your life. So I think you can pick up one book when you're in your early 20s, and then you can read it this in the same book but in your early 30s, and it's going to mean something completely different. So I think that's worth being conscious of, the fact that sometimes you're going to get a different thing from the book that you're reading. You're going to get a different message depending upon what's going on in your life. So things will speak to you at different times. So it's worth having that open mind and being able to sort of diversely explore things, because even if something doesn't connect with you initially, you might find that as you're in a different life situation, it connects with you at that point. So I think, yeah, you're
Mm.
very right with what you're saying.
Have you found that with Stoicism?
Yeah, 100%.
As you've gone through the stages of reading about Stoicism, it's changed, your appreciation of it has changed.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So my initial gateway into it was through voluntary discomfort. And this is the key thing that helped me with my anxiety. It was like counterintuitive, but step outside your comfort zone, actually build confidence, do that. So that was my first sort of way into it. But then it trickled into other parts of my life. And now it's something that I feel I use all the time. And it's like, now that I'm a dad as well, I feel that there's lots of these lessons that I can see that will be really helpful. And the more I read about it, different things jump out, and as your knowledge of the subject expands, certain things that you're like, oh, I know about this, and then maybe you'll come across an idea that you're not as familiar with, and then that jumps out more, whereas if you're not familiar with it, it's hard to sort of differentiate and pick out things. So I don't know if that makes sense. Like, there's certain things sparkle a bit more when you know the philosophy in detail, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I've found that recently when reading a lot about this idea of productivity. I recently read this book called by David Kadavi, who came on the podcast, and his book's on mind management, not time management. And it was interesting because when he was referencing his thought process about writing the book, every single book that he'd referenced, I'd read. And it was really interesting because
Yeah.
it went like, if 5 years ago, if I was reading that book, I would have had no idea what he's talking about. Like I
Yeah.
wouldn't have had idea about David Allen's books or Cal Newport's books. And then you read it and you have a reference point to go off, which is so helpful when you're reading a piece of information, regardless of whether it's a book or an article or a podcast, whatever it is. You have that bank of information and data that you can go and reference.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Absolutely. And I think, especially with the Stoics, sometimes if you read their original texts, they're constantly referencing other philosophers and other things. So, at first, on an initial read, you might be like, "Oh, I don't know who that person is," or "That doesn't make any sense." And who's this Diogenes guy who used to live in a barrel and do all these, like, swear at people and all that? Like. But when you have this better, broader understanding, it helps to you can, as exactly as you said, you can make that reference, and it helps bring a clearer picture to what they're actually trying to say.
How do you balance reading commentaries on Stoicism versus reading original texts? Because I think a lot of people, when they get into Stoicism, I've found a lot of people, they just go to the original texts, and it's very difficult to because obviously, they're just translations. It's very difficult to try and understand and it be applicable to your life. That's why I always recommend, people read, Ryan Holiday's work, your work. Um, Donald Robertson wrote a great book on Stoicism. There's many out there. So how do you balance reading sort of commentaries on Stoicism versus reading the original texts?
Well, one of my best friends used to study philosophy at university, and he always said to me, read about the philosopher first and then go back and read the original texts, because sometimes the original text can be
Yes.
really difficult. So, if you read someone talking about Descartes, then it makes sense more than if you go back and read Meditations on First Philosophy and your brain starts dribbling out your ears because you're like, what the hell is going on? This is just so complicated. But if someone can sort of synthesize that, I think that's very good. But I think it's important to have that balance. You're right, because otherwise you've got other people's opinions on it. So I think it's nice to have a mix. It's nice to be able to look at how different people bring it all together. So in my book, I'm trying to piece everything together and highlight different ideas, which might not be obvious when you read the Stoics initially, because it's certain things that you're like, okay, that is a theme, and you can see that it's recurring, but they don't explicitly say, here is the theme. So I think it's quite nice to get
Mm.
that balance, and for me, it's important to read the original text. So there's always like the three that I always say is a great place to start is Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, Discourses and Selected Writings by Epictetus, and Letters from a Stoic by Seneca. And those are like the three that will get you into it. And there's like it's a good foundation. They're kind of like the core, really the core text. And there's loads of stuff that you can get into, but it's trying to find that balance. And I think it's important to read what other people are thinking about it, because it's not a static philosophy. I think it can progress, and I think that's important as well, for there to be growth and development within the philosophy. And it's not just this, we have to keep it set in this
Mm.
specific way. I think it's important for it to grow, because times change and we need to be able to look at ideas and develop them.
What do you think are some of the core philosophies of Stoicism that you've read and studied that are most applicable in this day and age?
So I think the thing that's super helpful for me is the idea. It's got a technical term, the dichotomy of control. I call it the golden rule of Stoicism, because it kind of filters through everything. And Epictetus,
Yeah.
the Stoic, puts it beautifully when he says, "It's not what happens to you, but how you respond to it that matters." So this is all about what we can and can't control in life. So the Stoics acknowledge that there's so much that's outside of our control. However, we can choose how we respond to those events. And that's where we get our power back. And this is very, very helpful and very practical. So if you've got a setback, you're facing some kind of problem in your life, the very simple thing to do is to list all the things associated with that problem that are outside of your control and the things that are inside your control. And then you put all your energy into the things that are inside your control, and don't worry about the things outside of your control. Now, obviously, that's easier said than
Mm.
done, but that as a sort of process is incredibly practical, and it can really help you to put your energy and your thinking into the right place. So I think that's been immensely helpful. I've found that it's a simple concept, but it is very, very, very practical if you use it. And you actually do, I mean, you can write them down, you
Mm.
can physically write it down. And then you just think, you realize that there's so much that is outside of your control in life. Life is pretty chaotic and there's so
Mm.
many curveballs. So actually, it's all about what goes on in your mind and how you respond. So I love that. I think that's such a great piece of wisdom.
I think with that one, it's like the awareness is as important as the practice of doing it. Because it's like one of those things that once you have awareness of it, it completely changes everything.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's it. It's being conscious that that's even a thing, because I certainly know that my
Yeah.
mindset used to be, incredibly negative. And this was one of the things that I had to kind of reprogram my mind, because my internal dialogue was very, very negative, especially when I was in my sort of dark mental space with my anxiety. It was this very negative internal dialogue. So I know that you can change that and over time. But I think I wasn't even aware that concept existed, or that you could, that you could even focus on things that were inside your control, not worrying about things outside of your control. I think that, yeah, you're right. Being aware that it's even there is really important.
I love doing that exercise with people that I know who are like maybe like stressing out, or they're dealing with anxiety, and you just talk them through all the things that they're thinking about and what worrying about, and then you sort of give them that awareness. And it's amazing how much, people don't think that they're thinking that, even though that they're thinking that. So once you speak it back to them, they actually understand, like, oh, why am I worrying about that? But internally, and this is obviously something that you've gone through, you almost think that it's truth, like it's like an immovable object. But
Mm.
once you have someone speak it back to you, you realize that there is fluidity in it and it can be changed.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I think that's why this type of approach and this particular idea has influenced so many modern therapies, and why there's a real crossover with some of the concepts from Stoicism in modern therapy, and cognitive behavioral therapy in particular. It talks about challenging the way that you think and questioning your thoughts, questioning things, and using logic and reasoning to push back on your internal dialogue. And that's really, really based on these Stoic ideas.
Have you found perhaps a roadblock to endless questioning? I know we've been talking about the importance of questioning and improvement, and really getting to grips about how you think about the world and your perspective. But have you found a point in which perhaps your questioning has led to inaction to a degree? Because I feel like you have to go all one way from another way and then find a medium in between. Because when I was at university, I studied politics, and we did a lot of courses on philosophy, and reading a lot about philosophy, and I found myself being that quintessential philosopher, just sitting in a room and questioning and not really doing anything with it. And I feel like you have to go so far that way to then go back the other way and then find a happy medium.
Yes, exactly. I think it's overthinking as well that we can often suffer with, and it's that. Yeah, you're
Yeah.
right. It's that endless quest for knowledge and self development, and I think this is always an interesting balance. It's like you want to improve and you want to develop as a human being, but you also want to be able to be happy with where you are and how you're living at the moment. So it is important. I think that is something, especially in the self development and like space, and you see it a lot as this constant quest, constantly asking. And I think it's healthy to ask questions, but I think you're right. There needs to be some balance, and you need to sort of also appreciate where you are, and kind of be able to take a step back and not get all consumed, because I guess the thing with questions is that
Yeah.
they lead to more questions, and that just can go
Yeah.
that can go on forever, really. And
Yeah.
I think it's also it's worth contemplating, the questions in themselves. I like, for instance, just to take it into a little slightly different direction, in Zen Buddhism, there's this sort of concept of, well, who are you? It's a very simple question. Who are you? And then just thinking about that is such a deep, profound question that can kind of ripple off. But actually, just sort of staying with that initial question um, can be very interesting as an exercise, and just sitting. And there's this whole process,
Mm.
like if you're into meditation as well, there's a lot that can be done just by sort of sitting and letting these questions come and then float away. And I think, yeah, you're so right. You've got to find that balance with it all, because otherwise it's, you're never gonna be satisfied. But also there's an element of, it's not a bad thing to be like keep moving forward and questioning. So it is that balance. It's finding the
I
way to.
I kind of I see it as waves. Like I see it
Right.
as waves. Like over the
Okay.
past couple of months, I've really taken a step back from like in like exploring phase. I feel of like that you have an exploring phase and you have like a reflective phase. Like, and it kind of, you have to go with how you're feeling at the time. You know, in the past, I used to like push through explore phase, explore phase, explore phase, but then I didn't really spend any time reflecting on my personal progress or how my thinking has developed, all these types of things. And I think you have to sort of go to one phase and then go into another phase. Like I feel it's very difficult to balance those explore and reflective stages at the same time.
Yeah, I like that example. Yeah, I like that. That sounds like a good way of seeing it, because yeah, you're right. Things do move in those like these big waves, and I feel that writing as well is a bit like that, because you're in this sort of intense period of time where you're working on the book and you're creating and you're in this space, and then afterwards it kind of like it drops off and you're like, oh, I've handed in the manuscript, and now it's the sort of start of another cycle, and you're kind of you're like, okay, well, where am I putting my energy now? I've got all this time that's suddenly, you go from like writing constantly to then having this space. So yeah, you're right. It's interesting to do um, to think about how you're going to use your time. I guess for some people, you could be
Mm.
quite regimented, and I guess for me, because I have these sort of you write a book and then then there's a period of time, then you promote a book and then you write a book. It's just kind of this cyclical thing. So in a way, it's dictated to me how it works because of like just naturally kind of flowing with it. But I guess some people could be quite, okay, now I'm going to be in an explore mode. Now I'm going to be in a questioning mode. And I guess it's go with the flow, really, isn't it? Just try and listen to what feels right for you.
Yeah. I used to be really regimented. And I think over time I've realized that, why am I learning? You just said something about, in Zen Buddhism, you question who are you? But I really, over the last couple of months, I've really kind of took a step back and like, why am I learning all this stuff? Because
Mm.
as a content creator, you can sit back and I'm learning all this stuff to grow a following or, whatever it might be when it comes to actual content creation. But then I realized that I'm not creating this stuff for that. Like I'm not so I'm not reading these books for that. I'm reading these books for myself. Like if I'm not getting what I need to get out of the books, then what's the point of doing the rest of it? Like I just came up with a realization, and that was from taking a step back from explore phase. I spent the last year really learning a new skill in software engineering, and that kind of took my mind off the sort of the endless quest for book knowledge, which I thought was really helpful for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and to have that awareness to think, okay, what is it? What's the reason for all of this? And I certainly feel that with my writing as well. Like, what's the purpose? Is in a way, I'm writing the books that I wish that I had had when I was in my really dark place. So that's in a
Yeah.
way, it's for me. I'm writing it for myself, which not in a selfish way, but in a way of I'm trying to understand things, and this is really such a cathartic and interesting way for me to explore that. So that's really how I kind of view that. And I think it's interesting, what is the deeper purpose? Why are you doing this? So I think, yeah, it's worth taking a step back as well. You're right to just sort of think about the reasoning behind it.
Because I think not in a selfish way, but I think in a really important way, you need to understand that it's kind of for yourself at the start. If you think
Mm.
about like a Venn diagram of content creation or creation from an artistic point of view, it has to benefit you at some point. Like it can't just be of benefit to someone else. Like there has to be a benefit to you in the long term. Otherwise, it's not a sustainable practice. It's not a sustainable activity at all.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And I think that's it, because you don't know what's going to happen with it when you start putting content out. You don't know where it's going to go. So you've got to be doing it for the right reason. You've got to be doing it for yourself. You've got to be doing it because it's important to you. I wrote my first book. I didn't know if anyone was ever going to read it, because I didn't know if it was going to get picked
Mm,
up by a publisher or whether anyone else thought that there was value in it. But for me, I knew that this is something that I wanted to do. And it turns out that it was something that people wanted to read about. So I think it's as long as you're doing it, yeah, as long as you're doing it because it's for you and not sort of this commercial driven thing. I think that it's important. I think you're going to have more depth and you're going to get more satisfaction with the process if you're doing it for yourself rather than for some like external thing. If you're doing it for the followers or
Yeah.
the likes and the sales. I think it's important to really think about what it means to you.
Yeah. I think that's really, I think it's important in anything you do, but I think more so in the creation space, the artistic creation space, having that perspective. Because I feel like I've had it in my past where like I just created something purely for the sake of what it's going to get me rather than what it was for me. And I
Mm.
feel like sometimes that is quite detrimental to your spirit, if you want to say that.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think it's creative integrity, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. How is your approach then to this book changed, like from your creative integrity point of view? Like, how would you say your approach to writing this book has changed, from the first time? Like, how have you developed as a writer?
So I think what's interesting is I created the book in a different way. The first book was um, me just trying to find my voice and trying to find how I write, which is very casual, and it's kind of that's something that I feel is important for me, and that's who I am. I make pizza jokes and stuff, and like that to me is part of
Yeah.
who I am. I want that to come out in my writing. But the first book, it took a long time to write, and then it was like chiseling away, developing it, however many times I rewrote the book, a lot of times. But this book, and actually the cards as well, in a way it was backwards. It was looking for the big picture. So I created the structure. I thought deeply about each part and how I wanted to do that, researching each thing, and then started writing off that, because I feel that I I knew how I wanted to write, and I had that sense of what my writing voice is. So then it was like mapping it into the content that's already structured in place. So it's a very different way when you've created it. I had like one page with everything, the whole order of this book created. You can kind of look in the contents, and it's almost like working backwards like that. And I think that is interesting, because
Mm.
then you look at the big sort of line through the book, and then you can just have fun writing it. And I didn't write it from start to finish. I created it I wrote the principles first, and then sort of did the bits on either side of the principle afterwards. So I think it was a different way. And then when you read it and you make sure, then you read it in order, and you're like, okay, I've got to make sure that it flows and whatnot. So it's a different creative process, but I think having that ability to step back and sort of look at the bigger picture was really interesting. I think it works well. It certainly works for me incredibly well. It was an efficient way of
Mm.
writing the book. I didn't have to write it a bazillion times for it to be where I was happy with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. Like the impression that I got when I read the book was this idea that you've really formulated an understanding of the concept, and you're trying to, like you said earlier, distill that information. But there is definitely a thread throughout the book. Like there's definitely a core theme throughout that book, and then you're sort of piecing in information and relevant information, pieces of history, pieces of tasks. And you say in the book that it's an interactive one, which I think is really important in these types of books.
Yeah, I feel that that's really important to, each. So the 10 principles in the book, and each principle has about 5 challenges that they're small things, but they're just a way that you can consolidate that principle, and you can really test it out. And I think some of them are a bit quirky, some of them are a bit bizarre, but I like that. And that's sort of, it's all part of it to challenge the mind. The banana walk is a classic example, but there's some other things in there that are just done to, yeah, just push you in a little bit of a different direction, hopefully with an idea that you haven't come across before, or something slightly quirky. I always like the quirky things. They're not all quirky, bear in mind. Some of them are just very like, this is a perfect example of the, the principle. But I think it's important, yeah, because otherwise, if you read it, it doesn't have the same impact. I think it's when you put it into practice, when you go out and you do something, you're like, oh, actually, okay, that makes sense. I can feel it. That's when the idea will be useful for you.
I think this is everyone's issue, perhaps, who people who have an aversion to reading philosophy. It's like, how can that actually be practical in my life? Like, what is the practical benefit of reading this? And I think taking philosophy into action is perhaps the most difficult thing about reading philosophy. You know, it's very easy just to sit there and question, but then taking that into action is perhaps the most difficult thing about it.
Yeah, and I think that's why I connected to Stoicism so much, because it is such a pragmatic philosophy. You do read some philosophy, political theory, things that it's very difficult to be. How can you use that in your life? There's
I
some
know.
big ideas, like I recently read
Yeah, yeah.
Plato's Republic, which is an amazingly important philosophical book. And there are certain themes that I can take and I can borrow. There's incredible bits of wisdom there, but I think there's there some of it is it's just conceptual and not like it's really interesting to think about. But it's like, how does that help me when I'm about to have a panic attack, or how does it help me when I'm sat in the dentist waiting room, like about to have my teeth drilled out, like that. That's what I kind of I want something practical that can help me when I'm suffering, or
Yeah, yeah.
mentally just like trying to live. you know
Yeah, you're not gonna be taking the Republic into that situation. It's not gonna help you in any way,
no,
shape, or form.
exactly.
Yeah, that's what I think. Like that Stoicism. The interesting thing about Stoicism, it seems as if a lot of modern day therapies have derived a lot of their teachings from it. Like we had Donald Robertson, who came on the podcast, and he wrote the book How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, and he's a qualified cognitive behavioral therapist, and he talked about the benefits that he's found giving therapy and using Stoicism as a therapeutic tool, which I don't think a lot of people see it in that way.
I know, and I think he does great work with that. I love that he's connected those two things, and I think it's interesting how a lot of these ideas are actually tools. They're psychological tools when you think about them. In my book, we've got 10 principles, but they are tools. They are things that you can use, and the Stoics would use them like that. They would use them as ways of managing the mind. So I think it makes perfect sense that they would
Mm.
be adopted in modern therapy.
Mm. I think a great way to end this conversation, Ben, is you're someone who's very well read on Stoicism and someone who is has really good experience using the tools and practices. So I think giving a listener perhaps who doesn't have experience of Stoicism, like a bit of a start cheat sheet, like what are some of the things that they should be reading, what's some of the things that they should be thinking, if they're looking to study it and learn more about it, perhaps how you would have approached it knowing what you know now.
Okay, so I'll try and be concise. I'll give you a couple of ideas from the Stoics and then sort of a general where you can go
Yeah.
to read about them. So I think the first thing I'd recommend is, we mentioned it earlier, the dichotomy of control. This is super important. So whenever you face a setback, focus on what you can actually control. Focus on your response to the setback. So it doesn't matter what happens, it's how you respond to it. And that's a very powerful concept. So that's the first thing I'd think. Try really explore that. Think about that a lot. Test it out whenever you face a setback. The second thing I would recommend is, the Stoics used to contemplate their own mortality, memento mori. So they would do this for two reasons. They would do this to have gratitude for living, for being alive, for how wonderful life is, and to also make sure that they were living with purpose. So the average human life is 4,000 weeks long, which to me is not very long. 4,000 weeks, that seems, that's short. That feels short. So I think
Yeah.
thinking about that,
Yeah.
contemplating it, it can be a very, very empowering exercise. Are you living with purpose? Are you spending your time wisely? And are you grateful for existence? Now, obviously, this is something that probably should come with a disclaimer, because it's quite difficult to think about if you're not in a good mental space. Maybe skip this particular exercise until you're feeling mentally ready to do this. I talk about this in the book, and I make sure there is a disclaimer, because I think this is a difficult exercise for people. But at the same time, the flip side is you can get so much from contemplating that. And the next exercise
Mm.
I would say is get out of your comfort zone. Voluntary discomfort. This idea that if you deliberately,
Your favorite.
it's my favorite. Yeah, of course. It's how I got into it, and it's something I try and live. I've seen firsthand what it can do. So I will champion this message until until I die. I feel like it's so important. But yeah, just look at things that scare you. go and do them. Do things that you can, like, that push you out of your comfort zone to build resilience, and look for challenging ways to push yourself. And I think reading the
It, on
Stoics
on
is,
on sorry to interrupt you,
go
but
on.
on that note is really funny because every time I read your book, I always go back to this one thing that's on my on my bucket list that I just don't want to do. And every time I read your book, I'm always reminded about, like, Ben's always challenging himself. He's putting himself in voluntary discomfort. But I really don't want to jump out of a plane. Like, I just have an aversion. I don't see the point of it. Like, every single time I read your book, I'm like, Ben's all challenging himself, and there's me saying I'm never going to do this, and he's like, you're in my head about, you need to jump out of a plane because you need to overcome this fear.
Well, it's
I'm getting
interesting.
there. I'm
Yeah,
getting
well,
there.
look, that's it. Even just humoring it, like, and it's not easy. It takes time. I think the last time we spoke, I was telling you how one of the things on my anti-bucket list, things that I really, really don't want to do, was to give blood, because it terrified me.
Yes.
And I finally did it. I finally went and gave blood, and that for me was such a mental challenge. I found it really scary, but actually, off the back of it, it was incredibly empowering. I felt that this is something I need to do regularly because it was so hard. But actually, that's it. I found that it was a very practical way to make sure that I am living this philosophy and I am testing it out. So I think, yeah, whatever it is that scares you a bit, look at it and see if there's a way that it could become a challenge, and a way that you could, embrace that. And I think if people want to read the Stoics, I think, Marcus Aurelius's Meditations is a great way to get into it, because it's a very short book. And I think also reading about the Stoics through other people is a good way to start. And then, yeah, just test it out. Just get out there and start trying these ideas out. That's key, really. And I think if you do that, you'll find that they're incredibly practical and very transformative.
They definitely are. And I think the more that you read about it, like anything, the more the ideas form in your mind, and the more you get an understanding about what the purpose of the ideas are. Because ideas are great and ideas are really important, but if you don't understand how to practically apply those ideas and where they fit into your life, it's very difficult to get perspective on them. So yeah, I definitely think the more time you spend on them, the better.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's important to do that. It's important to find that balance with everything.
Yeah, definitely. Anyway, Ben, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. It was great to have you back on. And congratulations on the new book, How to Control The Uncontrollable. This book right here. Where's the best place that individuals can find you, whether it be website or social media?
So, yeah, the best place is benaldridge.com. And that's my website, and it's got links to my social media accounts, and there's a mailing list with a book club that goes out every month, and you can see pictures of me doing ridiculous things. And yeah, that's probably the best place to go. And yeah, that's my recommendation. But thank you so much for having me on. It's been great to chat to you
Perfect.
again. I really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Ben. It was great. It was great to have you on. I look forward to the next time. Thank you for listening to this podcast. Hopefully you found it helpful listening to Ben talk about his experience with Stoicism, and hopefully this has garnered some interest to go read some books around Stoicism. I'll put some links in the description below for some introductory readings on Stoicism. I know Ben mentioned some of his favorites towards the end of the conversation, but I'll put the links in the description below if you want to read any more of those as well. If you haven't already, please do subscribe to the podcast. Every week we release a podcast with an author to discuss their book and the ideas and principles inside of it. We have some amazing authors lined up in the next couple of months, so I definitely recommend subscribing, whether you're listening to this on Apple, Spotify or YouTube. Definitely hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for upcoming episodes. Thank you again for watching this podcast, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.